Please take POIs. Remember about the engagement. If you have any connection issues, please first text into the chat. Try to not unmute yourself, and unless explicit preference from the speaker, do not unmute yourself. To the audience, if you have connection issues and if you are reconnecting, please ensure that you are muted and your audio is muted and you are not interrupting the speakers. Don't use chat for your own purposes. You have shitposting groups for this. So please keep that in mind. Without further ado, I'm happy to call the Prime Minister to open this debate. Good luck, everyone.
Right. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. I can't take myself seriously. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I cannot for the life of me believe that I got a motion about Football Manager and I'm supposed to opt it. Nonetheless, I think we first want to establish what Doxtastic wants within this debate. I think the reality is that Doxtastic ultimately wants money, and there's several reasons. One, it is obviously for profit. The reg fee for this tournament should cue you into that. But second, I think clearly money enables a better future product at the point that you're able to, for example, like have the money to research, to invest in future R&D and therefore increase your market share. Third, I also think that your initial success is what is with the game is what is going to create greater fan following and greater market share, which in turn consolidates your position moving forward. Even if you talk about things like CSR in the status quo, these are already weighted in financial terms and the way in which this will benefit the corporation. To that degree, I think it's inescapable that a corporation wants money, and that needs to be the metric for the debate. We are going to run two things, therefore. First, why we think Doxtastic will earn more money on our side. Second, why I think in terms of the risk of developing the product, we are significantly better. First, why Doxtastic is going to earn more. I'm just going to call it Dox. There are two broad reasons we are going to suggest that they're going to earn more. The first is that this luck-based game is going to have a significantly greater degree of access for individuals to play the game. There are several reasons for this. The first is that there's a fundamentally lower barrier of entry. On that side of the house, access is going to be fundamentally limited because some people are going to keep on losing at a point they don't have the skills. Note that these are people who are likely to be your casual gamers who otherwise have gotten in because you don't have the time to just devote to that game and improve your skills. Therefore, there are two further things to note. The first is that people generally don't enjoy losing, and therefore the more they lose, the more they're going to leave the game very quickly, or the more reviewers are going to tell people don't bother playing this game unless you're going to devote a huge amount of time to it, which means that even your initial entry point is very limited, but also the extent to which people stay involved in the game and buy future editions is very limited. But second, also people just don't like feeling dumb, especially in a capitalist society that already prioritizes the skill sets of individuals in success within the real world. The fact that this fails as a matter of escapism because it similarly premises itself on your mental ability to play the game is problematic. The way, like, I spend most of this tournament upset because my FM is not going well. I think that proves the point. But further to that, I also think that what this means that you end up with a niche consumer base on that side of the house. Note that niche does not mean exclusive, it does not mean big spending. Number one, very few games are going to get big enough to reach the level of Starcraft having international tournaments, for example. Your odds of reaching there are incredibly small. Even if you do, it is entirely unclear that people are going to pay significantly for these games, because just because they are niche, just because few people play the game does not mean these few people don't also play other skills-based games that are similar. See that like people who play Counter-Strike tend to also play other games like Dota, which means that I don't think you get a significant win on that count. The comparative is that you're always going to have a chance if it's a luck-based game, right? And that hooks people. The fact that in casinos, the epitome of chance, people still go back and back and back is because one, there's adrenaline out of not knowing what's going to happen, and therefore that makes people want to care more. But secondly, I want to note that it's also the case that people tend to believe that they overestimate the extent of control that they might have over the game in a particular point in time, like even though they rationally know that it's a luck-based game, and that in turn hooks people to keep going back and back and back. I think a great example, and so that's why I think the chance thing is important. And the important thing to note is even if people lose a lot more than they win, the times that they win are going to be more valuable. For example, I've only beaten Sherms in rounds 2 or 3 times, but those are the most important rounds that we keep talking about and that she keeps remembering. The further thing to note is that I think it's also just significantly less tiring. The fact that you can check out and play this in a brainless manner is particularly important to making people want to enter this game. The reason this is important is because in terms of the way in which you earn money, i.e. subscription fees, ad sales, in-app purchases, these are all more likely if you're able to broaden the base of people who are playing this game, and therefore you're able to sell more of these products, you're able to stonk more as the corporation. But second, in terms of the progression possibility, there are 4 reasons why I think the ability for you to progress the game and therefore earn more money from your consumer base is greater. The first thing to note is that the 420 is going to be fundamentally very, very hard to monetize. And the reason for that is if you want it to be skill-based, that is mutually exclusive to being sales-based, for the reason that one is likely to make a niche community particularly angry that they keep having to spend, especially in a world where these young people tend to intersect with like liberal logic, for example. But second, also because if it's really the case that money is the way you win, then it's hard to see the value of the skills that you try to package yourself on, which in turn means it's very difficult to see, one, why this is fair, but two, what the value of playing is. Vis-a-vis a world where you can quantify the fact that you have extra chance, you can play an extra turn, and those are things that are very easy to grasp onto and make people want to spend. The second thing to note is that the more it's skill-based and intense, the more things like advertisements are going to piss people off. And the implication of this is that they're going to like not be willing to upgrade because they're angry against the corporation and they choose to play a different game that exists. For example, Blokudoku, the game Shams and I play, and I'm better at her than her at, is one where ultimately the things that advertisements can only come at the very end of games as opposed to other games that intersperse them, because there's a recognition that that will ruin the gaming experience for individuals. Third, I think the problem is that even if you want to like produce a high-level skills-based game, people are going to bitch about the fact that it still comes down to chance at the end of the day. And that kind of bitching is what's going to hurt people's willingness to commit to your particular game in the long term. For example, the Football Manager developers get very upset repeatedly because people complain about the degree of luck that exists in the game, but that is still a reason that's often cited for why people stop buying future editions, which actually leads into the fourth reason, which is that at the point that the core of the game has to be similar, because you can't radically change it, people are less likely to buy into future editions of that game because the original was sufficient for them. Contrast this to a luck-based game where, because the way in which the luck changes very often, because it's easy to develop, you can constantly push out new luck-based games. You can constantly change the way this works while keeping like the core luck-based approach the same, and that makes people want to play into and buy new versions. Yes, CEO.
I think you overestimate the degree of competitiveness people have. Most people just like to have a laugh with their friends after they beat their ass in PvP, or just log on to League after a long day at work.
No, man, the fact that it's 3 a.m. I'm still talking to you suggests that competitiveness is something that matters to people. But also the reality is that people get a thrill of like winning, and that's why these games are inherently competitive, right? Like the thrill that you get in the game is of beating other individuals, raising your MMR. The fact that all of these particular like what's the word? These achievements of success exist suggest to me that this is important. Second, on the idea of risk, I want to note that very, very high degree of effort is going to be needed to make this game airtight and ensure that there are no problems or bloopers within the game. And there's a few reasons. One, a niche community is going to expect significantly more out of the game in terms of one, every future edition, but also the fact that every edition cannot be flawed, because if not, it spoils the idea that the skills are being valued. But secondly, also in comparison, your luck-based game, at the point that if the whole game is about luck, random bloopers can just be seen as another bit of luck within the game. See Flappy Bird and the fact that even though it's buggy, people thought it was part of the appeal because the game was about trying your luck. At the end of the day, therefore, we think we are more in line with the profit incentive of the corporation. We are proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. It's time for the opposition to open the case for the bench.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Thank you. 3, 2, 1. Two extraneous points of response. First, on reviewers trashing you. I think this is extremely unlikely, because at the point where reviewers presumably are people who care about their reputation for being able to do well on skills, and specifically care about the public call out of, you were just too silly to get it. And at the point where that is the reputation that they have a meaningful reason to, even if they didn't enjoy the game, to pretend they did in order to look good to an elitist audience, because the people who consume reviewers like material are likely to be people who are disproportionately invested in skills-based games. Because honestly, I have never read a single video game review. I'd like play a bunch of luck-based nonsense that nobody gives a fuck, and I honestly don't think that like the random audience reads them. Secondly, on the implicit assumption that it's really easy to get people to opt into a luck-based game, I just think that this is relatively unlikely, because I think the markets are probably symmetrically saturated, at which point I think we have to some extent assume that there is a like reasonable ability for this game to be of high quality in order to get people interested for reasons that are extrinsic to this mechanistic, like to this mechanic difference, i.e. things like good visuals, having like engaging basic story, having funny jokes, whatever, like is something that gets people into playing video games. I honestly have no idea what the fuck it is. Okay, let's talk about two things. One, where you get player base, two, where you get esports, all of those things being good. on like the lower entry barrier, I think that there's probably a meaningful incentive on this company to be able to like lower the entry barrier to the like more skills-based game. There's several reasons for this. One, you can have a very low initial cost because you know that at the point where people are sinking cost and time that is hard to transfer into another game with different mechanics where they would have to relearn things in order to experience a symmetric sensation of being good at the thing. That means that they can have a low initial cost because they know that a decent amount of those people is going to be sold on repeated interactions and DLCs and cosmetics in order to have more fun when playing the game, at the point where it is incredibly unlikely that they will switch, meaning that you can offer it at a disproportionately lower price. Secondly, obviously, you can have a meaningful amount of skills teaching. Thirdly, you can have escalating matchmaking, as in you're paired with people who are approximately your same score level, meaning that you're largely competing against people who you actually do have a chance at beating based on your skill and based on marginal skills improvement, because honestly, that's probably the sensible way in order to sell people on a skills-based game. I don't see why you wouldn't do that. As a result of that, you are likely to get a reasonable amount of initial buy-in. Why is initial buy-in incredibly valuable at the point where these people are much likelier to stick around on our side? There's several reasons for that. A, social hierarchies. At the point where something is skills-based, it is massively easier to build like people's self-esteem around the fact that they are good at this and the fact that they care about their friends thinking they are good at this, as opposed to people who are quitters at the point where something gets hard, because that is something that is socially looked down upon, which means that they will keep trying, keep like actually investing and becoming better at it, invest more and more time, which presumably means that they're more likely to spend on future versions. Secondly, there's a sunk cost thing. Because at the point where you're used to being good using the mechanics of one particular game, that means that any switch means that while you're used to being among the good people, you are now less likely to be meaningfully good at the mechanics of that additional thing, meaning that you're relatively less likely to switch into that at the point where we have gotten you hooked in the first place. I think that's probably something that we're relatively likely to achieve with like people who are, you know, just getting into games, etc. Those people become an effectively captive audience. That is something that is particularly valuable, meaning that you're likely to have those people stick around. Note that the comparison, given that you don't get better at a luck-based game, every luck-based game that you might be going into will give you like pretty much similar sensation of like, ooh, like excitement outcome. That means that every new luck-based game that you actually try to sell will have to recompete with every other luck-based game that's out in the market, because there's no meaningful differentiator in terms of people's ability to access the experience, meaning that the second thing that you try and sell in the second update, etc., is less likely to succeed. Third mechanism, you're likely to like just feel better at the point where you learned things. You feel like you are actually improving yourself as a person in a metric that you care about that is socially reinforced by others. That means that you just like, human brain likes learning because human brain needs to learn like learning in order to like do well evolutionarily, meaning that this is a sensation that is rewarded by the brain chemicals. Fourthly, you have continuous interest because you can the point is you want to expand the application of the skill to other new things, because that is, I mean, fundamentally, the thing that you want to do with a competitive thing, right? Because at the point where people have reached a certain ceiling on the skills, what you do is you sell them a new thing that they can continue having enjoyment on that. Note that the selling point oftentimes on proposition will be things like nostalgia, because people value having the same sensation over and over, meaning they might be perfectly happy with just the first basis thing and not necessarily want to buy a lot of expansion things, etc. But also because there's lots of other cheap options for getting relatively similar sensations. Like basically, I mean, honestly, I think Uno pretty much gives you the same sensation of that set of cards. Lastly, like in terms of weighing, I think the audience that you appeal to on our side of the house is likely to be relatively spendier, because they are likely to be more exclusive in the like realm of gaming as opposed to looking for other things, because you've just gotten them hooked on something that they spend hours and hours on, meaning that they're less likely to find equal enjoyment in other areas, meaning that you are likelier to get those people to actually spend more on you as opposed to people who are into luck-based things, who are likely more casual and more willing to also find the same sensation from other sources. Before going into anything further, CG.
So do you think that this corporation has other games in the waiting dock as well?
Yeah, probably. Okay, second layer of material, which is on esports and streamers. Look, those develop exclusively for these things insofar as at the point where you have something that is skills-based, that makes it significantly more interesting to watch, i.e. I'm not going to watch someone like play a slot machine because I could be doing the exact same thing and I would probably have more fun doing that. However, I can't be throwing the exact same skill level as that other person, meaning that it is interesting for me to watch. Similarly, at the point where something is competitive, you're likely to have people actually competing and investing and like competing against each other and like building tournaments. Not that those don't initially need a lot of startup money, and basically just needs people who enjoy playing the thing and are like increasingly competing against each other until that becomes large enough to become like capitalized on by ad companies, etc. That is something that happens significantly more as the point where it is meaningfully skills based. That means that you likely have a decent amount of esports being created around this, even at the point where it is initially relatively casual. This benefits you in a variety of ways. A, you get free advertisement because those people are likely to not only like keep promoting the game, but specifically also to escalate the level of game that they play, i.e. in order to keep being ahead of the average player, in order to keep being watched and keep being interesting, that means that they have a meaningful amount of reason to use expansions of like the skills application, to use expansion world parts of the world to make their thing look aesthetically pleasing and buy the things that they need for that, because otherwise they become boring. That means that the people who care about watching these people because they think they are better at skills, they now also have a demand created in them to have the additional thing that you're trying to sell them, because they admire those people and they feel a gap in their life from not having that in their life. That means that they probably are likely to become relatively well sold on additional things you're trying to sell them. Secondly, you're trying to find the best ways of playing the game. That's probably something that's relatively useful in terms of getting people more and more interested in it, because they're going to explore the most interesting parts of the game, the things that are most appealing for people, meaning that there's a continuous expectation that you will find more interesting stuff in it, meaning that you actually see value in continuing to play. Secondly, it is also generally more likely to generate investment, i.e. you have a higher likelihood of having investors in any kind of esports tournaments also want the game to continue to succeed and to develop, because they have a past stake in the tournaments that already exist, meaning they want those to continue to be successful and interesting, at which point they want the game to develop further and become more interesting, meaning they also want to make sure that you have the means to do that. For all of those reasons, oh well.
Thank you very much. It's time for DPM to respond to continue the round.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
All right, cool. All right, it's better. Okay. Starting my speech. In 3, 2, 1. Note that I think that the biggest problem in the opening opposition is they give us plausible reasons why people might enjoy skills-based games, but don't at any point link those incentives or truths to the particular actor and the decision that they have to be making right now. So let's talk a little bit about Dox, right? And I don't think that there was any refutation that we heard as to why exactly Dox cares the most about money. And I think that to that end, they don't actually prove to you why is it that as a medium-sized video game company at this particular juncture in which you have to choose between one of two games, your investment is going to be on a higher risk game that will require significantly higher investment to be able to generate and market out into the gaming world at large, and why exactly that's likely to net you the kind of capital required to later expand to become a more profitable company in the future. A couple of points of refutation specifically with regards to the addictiveness of that game, but I want to highlight that as long as they don't prove to you why it justifies the risk beyond plausible reasons why people might enjoy it, why you can break to that market, and why it's going to net you more money in terms of expansion packs and the like, especially in the short term, because that's what medium-sized video game companies need. They need short, quick, great amounts of capital infusion so that they can funnel that money back into their company very quickly in an oversaturated market in a way that allows them to continue surviving in that particular industry and to be able to invest more to create better games later in the future, or to invest more to create a greater diversity of games, because gaming requires developers, designers, etc. to make one of those slam dunk games. You actually need quite a lot of money. So I think those are the incentives right now. So what do they say about why exactly this game is problematic? I think the first big question that we need to ask then is just a general idea of like, what is society like? What do we respond to the most? And I think that this is probably quite a skewed audience sample size, but I just want you to think of the average person on the street and not think about this as a debater who likes to think of ourselves as intellectual and smart and caring about skills and stuff like that, right? The average individual works a 9 to 5 with our current society, or if you live in Hong Kong or Singapore, 9 to 8. And oftentimes this means that you're incredibly tired, you use your brain a lot in society. Also, increasingly, there's competition in society, which is to say that you need to fight with the person next to you to get a better degree. For example, you need to fight with the person on the other side of your cubicle in order to get a promotion, etc. Our life is entirely about competition and ranking us in order of our abilities to be able to achieve something. It is fucking exhausting. And I can say that because I come from Singapore, in which it is 3 a.m. and I'm still debating this tournament, right? So what is the point that I'm trying to make here? The point that I'm trying to make is, yes, it is true. You might always have a niche number of people who are willing to invest an hour uninterrupted into using the maximum amount of their brain to play this game properly. But the truth of the matter is that for immediate penetration into the market, to get the most amount of returns that you otherwise would have, you need to cater to the individual who is sick and tired of having to work hard, sick and tired of being told that they are not good enough, and sick and tired of using their brain day in and day out. What then is the answer? Look, Candy Crush was a bloody epidemic. My own mother spent money to play Candy Crush. And the reason for that is because she's an overworked bank executive that like cannot be fucked to play Counter-Strike or learn how to play Counter-Strike for that matter. And note that there's the vast majority of people that exist out there in society, not just the young people, but older people, for example, people who don't want to learn how to use the mechanics of a computer, buy the newest gaming mouse, buy the best setup so that they can reduce their reaction time by 0.05% seconds or whatever the hell it is that other people do when they play games like Counter-Strike, right? And Starcraft. So I think precisely because of that, the way which you're able to target the middle-aged people, the ones with the spending power to watch all your ads and to buy all your stupid beautification expansion packs, is if you have a dopamine rush that makes the game so addictive that people have no choice but to continue playing, because each game requires very limited amount of attention, limited amount of time, and gives you the immediate kick that you want at the end of a long, exhausting day in the office. But the second thing to note here is the idea of monetization. Because on the side of the OO, they at best give us plausible reasons why people might buy your expansion pack. But the problem here is, I think that there is an immediate benefit to you being able to sell these kinds of luck-based games, because it allows you to put ads on the game. You can put all the ads that you want. If you want like another 5 crystals or another 10 lives, you have to watch a 30-second ad, and that guarantees that you're able to get the kind of outcome that you want. In a skills-based game, it's much harder for you to be able to do that, because oftentimes people get really pissed off when they have to stop playing and turn off their mind from like the skills-based game, for example, or for example, they play like 1 hour long games before ads come into the game or whatever, or the kind of intellectual mindset that people are in. They're much more averse to playing the ads, as opposed to people who are already drawn in the kind of demographic they're likely to be drawn into the luck-based game in the first place. But the second thing is, and I think this is just quite important, right? It's just, are people going to be immediately attracted to it? And I think the question here is, you can download many luck-based games at once because all of them require very little investment. The problem with a game like chess, and I know this because my brother was a national chess player and it's the only thing in life that he's better than me at, is that it's a very high barrier to entry, and even higher if you want to be globally competitive. You might argue that you can put people up against others of similar elo, but I think the biggest problem here is the amount of pain that you feel when you know that the reason why you lost is because you are not good enough and you are not smart enough to beat the other person. And I think that's uniquely what turns people away from their game, or at least massively depletes the amount of playing time they were willing to put into their game. I'll take a POI from CEO if you guys have anything.
Yeah, this motion isn't about things like Candy Crush. Like things like Mario Kart still allow you to exert effort and make you think that there's skill involved, but like you can't place ads in the middle of random races.
Yeah. So I think you can talk about Candy Crush in the one hand. You can also talk about Mario Kart. You can still have like, you know, ads at the end of a Mario Kart game. Like, I don't think anyone has a huge problem with that. But also people spend a lot of money on Mario Kart to like, I don't know, make their kart go faster or make Princess whatever look better. Look, I don't know. This Yoshi thing is like Naomi's thing, not mine. But yeah, I think it's much easier for you to get people to like pay for those things instead. Right. The next thing then, the OO says, but people are told that you should not be quitters because that is something that's socially drilled into you. Again, this is not your job. It's not something that you have to tell other people that you're doing, something that you play on the train on the way home. So presumably, like, you don't actually want to continue being told you can't be a quitter in these games, but also with regards to your capacity to be able to spend, right? I think people don't fundamentally think money changes the skill in a luck-based game, because it's kind of like evening out the playing field. My friend got a better draw the other time, so I'm just evening it out to increase the odds in my favor. Versus a skill-based game where you can't actually sell these kinds of like iterated or like, you know, short term, when people are on the dopamine kick, kind of like impulse purchases, because if it drastically changes the extent to which skill is able to win you that game, then those kinds of money cannot properly be spent. The last thing is this idea of a ceiling of skills, and I think this is about your capacity to be able to do these things in the future. One, we can give you other versions of this particular game, and I think people are likely to buy it because, you know, they're just kind of like on that dopamine kick. But secondly, like, if it's true that there's a ceiling of skill, I can just keep playing against better and better players later within the same game and not buy your next game instead. The last thing that I want to say, and I want to apologize to everyone because of this, but I'm going to play poker with Abhinav later, which I am convinced is a chance-based game. And he promised me 5 quid if I do this. So I'll rise up, I'll rise like this. Okay, thanks guys.
Thank you very much for that speech. And it's time for Dilo to close the debate on a top half.
Checking that I'm audible.
Yeah.
opening gov is correct that we are not questioning the metric that this company presumably wants to have more money in order to be able to expand later. The point what we are saying is that on our side, we have a significantly higher likelihood and it is less risky, meaning that we are more likely to be getting more players, more buy-in. And we also explain why it is better to have that sort of niche, smaller, even though I question that community that is actually subscribing to your long term as opposed to doing something incredibly risky on their side. I'm going to go through all of this in the speech. Number one, why we do get a decent initial buy-in. Opening gov says that people do not like losing and therefore people are going to quit and they are not going to come because the barrier to entry is really, really high. I think Kat already explains, and this is not responded to, that you probably have things like rank-based matchmaking at the start of the game, right? Like you start low rank, you're going to climb. This means that even if I'm the worst, stupidest player ever, presumably you can still, A, have very casual gaming that is going to happen on like that lower level. So like even if I'm someone who just wants to like have fun with my friends, I can still do it on like a very less competitive basis. But B, like even if I'm really bad, I'm going to eventually master the basics probably quite quickly. So when new players come in who have absolutely zero clue what they are doing, I'm still going to beat them and I'm still going to feel good about myself. Meaning that the constant losing they want to talk about will not occur. People are actually very likely to join us on our side, right? The thing is that people are very interested in games like this, also because in the terms that people are competitive and people want to win, this opens them a new avenue in which they can do it, right? The point is that like currently you might have a lot of skill-based games where people are already good at. Now we have a new one where no one is good at yet, meaning that people want to join in because they feel like maybe I'm going to be the one who's going to get good at it. So meaning that the competitive people can join as well. While there's some comparatively significantly more risky in terms of the initial buy-in. Problem with them is that they have to be significantly more creative and unique in the concept that they are offering. And I just doubt that they are able to prove that they will. Like, know that there is already a significant number of luck-based games that exist that provide the exact same sensation. That is like, they have, like, there are a bunch of those that are where you have like some like bizarre something jumping and then something jumps at you. Like the point is that there's so many of them that in order to actually get a significant player base that is going to get interested in their game, they have to be very, very conceptually unique. The problem with that is that that's quite unlikely. On our side, we have a like skill-based mechanics in the like we are significantly more likely to be actually unique in a way that people will want to buy in. The second reason why it's more risky is just you get the people less sustained, like even if they get like a somewhat small revenue at the very start, like not very often when you're starting, you have to put the price relatively low, or like you have to like base it on ads that also don't give you that much money, or like and people are going to get annoyed by them, meaning that like just from the initial small revenue, they're also unlikely to get much. Why are then players likely to stay on our side? I would know that on our side, it's significantly more fulfilling and significantly less frustrating, right? Like their analogy of like people want to do like they do get adrenaline, which is why they go to casinos, don't work because like people go there because they lost money and they want to win money. The problem that you have with luck-based games is that people experience the level of unfairness because like people, when you play the luck-based game, you often do not perceive it as a luck-based game. You often like, it's still something that is perceived as a game that is about skill. Like often the way that these games like Mario Kart are like structured, etc., you still get like game over. You still get like you lost or like you won. Very often, this means that people actually do not like realize that a lot of this is luck-based in the same way that people like often just like in real life, right? Like you don't realize the aspects of luck that exists in like your day-to-day successes, meaning that people are likely to perceive it as skill-based anyway, meaning that they get incredibly frustrated at the point when they are losing, which is going to happen on their side as well. The problem is that it feels unjustified and people feel angry, right? Like I'm going to be less angry if I lose this debate because I lose this debate than like if all the judges roll a dice and then like I lose, right? Like that's going to be significantly more frustrating because similarly as those players, you would feel like, oh, I tried my best, but I still lost. That's significantly more frustrating than if you plus play. A couple things that they actually don't engage with in terms of social success, in terms of the fact that you have an actual sunk cost, meaning that people are unlikely to leave. On their side, you are comparatively very easy to just switch, right? Like someone brings a similar luck-based game that is incredibly easy to develop, someone who is from not a medium-sized company, but maybe from a bigger-sized company, they're going to can do the exact same concept, Point is, people are much more likely to switch because it has a better design, it has something funky in it. Because of that, people can switch from this game to their game significantly quicker than it would happen on our side, where people are likely to stick around because they already invested in. A couple of mechanisms that card gives you that are again not responded to. Like, note that on their side they have to give a significantly larger amount of, for example, advertisement into it. On our side, we have extra mechanisms that exist that we can distribute the game among a bigger variety of players, just because the fact that it is skill based. That gives you two, right? One, you just have a higher likelihood of attracting people who are streaming. Like, as a streamer, the games that you are picking are games where you can showcase the fact that they are good, right? Like, this is something that is exciting for people to watch. There is many people who watch streamers regularly. If the streamer that I watch play one game, now picks another game, and they are showcasing it, many people are likely to pick that game as well and try it as well. They don't have that on their side of the house because they don't get that natural sort of extra. I'll take closing off now.
Your ability to have ranks or tiers is contingent on you having an initially large market, because if not, you'll have incredibly long waiting times for people to be sorted in with people of similar rank, in which case a small company is not able to do so.
No. So, obviously, right when you start, you are likely going to have everyone being on a similar rank, and everyone's going to play around the similar, in the similar position. Then, those people are going to climb slightly up, and then, as the player base on this mechanism is going to expand, you're going to get extra people climbing in, blah blah blah. And you're just always going to have a group that's going to be decently large. Second thing we say is that you're much more likely to be, for example, later on selected as an esport that brings shit tons of revenue as a result. Why then on weighing, we would rather have a stable player base as opposed to the bigger initial one. Know that most of revenue that you as a game are able to get is from continuous subscriptions, right? Games hardly ever, especially as a small company, can have a really large initial price, especially if you are new. Well, this means that the revenue you get, even if they nominally get somewhat bigger number of people, is very small. On our side, you get people who will want to buy DLCs that are really expensive. If you want to buy cosmetics, the only reason why people buy it is because they are sure that this is going to be a continuous investment. For all those reasons, opening up.
Thank you very much to the OL and to the top half so far, and it's time for a member of the government to open the case for closing government.
Hello. Can I be seen and heard?
Yeah, both.
All right. Wonderful. All right, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I want to note is that the top half is based on a deadlock of who is the average person, which is clearly not convincing since many people are competitive while other people might want to be able to deal with luck. What we're going to do is, number one, explain which demographics specifically opt into either, but secondly, I want to do some very clear-cut framing. You are a medium-sized company, and I'd like to point out how difficult it is to be able to make a skills-based game. I'll assess the comparative within the first argument, but notice, the competition that both OG and OO point to, because they both point it out, are likely to exist on both sides, and therefore, the capacity to assess the likelihood of success of us being able to make a good game, being able to effectively advertise it, is probably the tipping point in this debate, rather than just whether or not people are going to like one more than the other, because quite clearly, this could possibly happen equally as OG and OO point out. And that's the first thing I want to be able to assess. I want to talk about capacity and why it is so hard and expensive, particularly for a medium-sized company who couldn't even afford to make 2 games, as pointed out in the info slide, to be able to do this, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's a skills-based game, you have to isolate all other factors that are non-skill. What does that mean, and why does that increase spending massively? A, you have to spend on servers in many different locations because you have to reduce the amount of lag that exists. Because obviously players who are very obsessed with competition and skill would not want external factors like their internet to be the determinant of whether or not they win or lose. Secondly, it also means you have to spend significantly on teams testing every little change you make into the game, assessing whether or not it's fair, assessing whether or not players will feel rewarded for the amount that they put in, and therefore, the capacity to do this is also increasing the hiring process that you require. But thirdly, you have to spend on things like anti-hacking, which are incredibly expensive because you have to check every single game that occurs, look at every single report that comes your way, and therefore, the extent to which it is so difficult to be able to maintain this game means either you are unable to do this effectively and people opt out of the game and are pissed because it is unfair, or you spend so massively on it that you're unable to meaningfully advertise this game as a result. But secondly, I want to talk about the conundrum that skills-based games often turn to, i.e., do we want to change the game? Because if you don't change the game at all, people get bored. They do not want to play the same game for multiple years time and time again. But if you do change the game, the trouble with that is players no longer feel rewarded because of the difference within the meta or the most efficient tactics available, the difference in terms of the investment of their own skills into the game that are now suddenly changed, and that was all meaningless. So on either side, it is this conundrum that means that either option you pick is likely to ensure you lose a degree of your player base. The comparative on our side is we can just change the game in the way that we want and cater to the wants of the players, because uniquely, they don't care about fairness. They know that this game is unfair. We can change it to make it more exciting. We can change the odds to ensure that it's a bit more thrilling, or change the stakes and what you're able to get as a result. And here's the comparative. Number one, these casual players are less likely to care about you spending on all these costs, because even if you're a bit laggy in something like Mario Kart, it's unlikely you feel like this is just one of multiple other determining random factors that affect whether or not you win. You're not going to get pissed over it, and therefore you don't lose them if you don't spend to this extent. Secondly, it's a lot easier to work on because all the unique selling propositions that OO talks about, like changing the game, changing the graphics, etc., are easier insofar as you are not constrained to the extent that fairness makes it so difficult for you to change one thing because you're afraid of potentially affecting other things that might happen in the game, and therefore it's easier to come up with this uniqueness as a result. So in terms of capacity, we don't know if this will be a good game, and it is so difficult to make a good game, as I point out. As a medium-sized company, this is the most strategic option you ought to take. Secondly, on demographics, who do you cater to? Because maybe some people are competitive, maybe some people are casual. Why is it worse to be able to cater to the committed competitive player base? For a couple of reasons. Number one, the player who commits a significant amount of hours to learn the game, to grind it out, are also just not very useful consumers, because the reason they have so much free time is probably that they don't have very much purchasing power, they're not very busy with work or other things that might increase their capacity to buy things. But secondly, let's assume that wasn't true. It's also the fact that you probably can't pay to win this game, or else that would be unfair and not skills-based, and therefore the things that they spend on are likely external to the game in order to help them improve, i.e. the money instead goes to buying a better mouse, buying a better keyboard, a better headset, etc. And with each additional cost that they accrue, it's unlikely that it instead goes to the game because this helps their gaming experience. Whereas on our side, maybe you can pay to ensure your stakes are higher, maybe you can pay to increase your chances of randomness. We don't care because everyone already knows the extent to which it is random and unfair already, and therefore you can pursue that kind of business model. The conclusion is either this is not a very good base to attract, or that even if it is a good base to attract, they're not spending on the game regardless. But the comparative is simple. Number one, the people who can carve out a bit of time for a random game that they don't need to know every single little thing about are also the people who have the capacity to spend and therefore are likely to be a more important base as a result. But secondly, we just tap into huge markets. Number one of the largest spenders of games today are children who cannot put their minds around the very complex mechanics that are required in Starcraft or CSGO, and therefore it is much easier to enjoin them to be able to join your game and their parents to be able to pay for what you want. But secondly is women, and I'm not going to say that women are bad at games, but I will say in skills-based games, women are more disproportionately to be flamed, most disproportionately to be blamed for their lack of skill, and therefore they fall out because even if they enjoy the game, they're unlikely to enjoy the people they play the game with because their teammates are always blaming them, and therefore that's 50% of the population and market you're opting out of. So all this is an incredibly important group of people that they're unable to access as a result. Third point, I want to talk about the spread. How do you spread skills-based games? And note that almost all skills-based games that have been incredibly popular have been tied to competitive leagues, which have been incredibly expensive, and at best they break even. At worst, it is catastrophic, like the Overwatch League, with Overwatch now dying and also just not being able to ensure that they could also pay the cost of the initial investment. And this is incredibly expensive, right? There are often million-dollar contracts to attract players from other games. So Valorant, which is a huge company of Riot, had to be able to ensure that many teams would pay million-dollar salaries so that people would quit CSGO and play Valorant instead. It is large-scale streaming like platforms and deals, like not Twitch, but being able to have them on a stage, being able to put them together on LAN, etc., are all incredibly expensive. How does word spread about our game? Not only can you do advertising on both sides, but absent that, it is also things like, because anyone is able to play that game, it spreads through things like parties. It spreads through things like people just inviting their friends to be able to want to play with them. And that's far easier to do because people don't feel like they have to go through such a rigorous and difficult learning curve. And instead, like rather than being able to look at the people who are the best of the best, to be able to look at the degree to which their skill exists within the game, and therefore the natural advertising, because the paid advertising is probably equal on both sides, is far likely to be greater and more effective on government side as well. So we can't just make assertions about what people like. We have to talk about which people these are and what the degree to which the game will be actually good on either side of the debate. Closing government is very happy. PogChamp.
Thank you very much. And it's time for a member of the UP to open the case for closing opposition.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Just give me a second. Set up my timer. Okay. I will be starting in 3, 2, 1. Before extending on why we're better able to get revenue, the mutual metric in this debate, just a couple of pieces of framing that I think take out both government sides. First of all, contrary to what closing government tells you, being a medium-sized company tells us a lot about the capacity of this company to produce games. Know that within the gaming market, most studios are small garage-type studios with very limited capital and small developer teams. Being able to be a medium-sized company and have the capital as well as the manpower and acumen to maintain 2 separate gaming projects, or at least start 2 separate gaming projects as a viable venture, means that you have already, as a company, broken through a relatively saturated market. This means that you'll probably have the ability to make a relatively good game and to excel in different genres for you to be able to produce and create ideas for 2 different games at once. And for this debate to ever exist, we need to have a company which already has been sufficiently able to sustain 2 different projects and have the skill to maintain them. Secondly, we don't have to be idiots in advertising this. And this is going to directly clash with the closing government claim on advertising. And I think we can reach a lot of people. First of all, we can offer free-to-play versions which get people hooked on the game and then lock out the most interesting pieces of content for people to pay for once they're hooked. Secondly, we can introduce pick a friend incentives, which is what a lot of MMORPGs like World of Warcraft do, where you offer current players incentives if they bring another subscriber. So give them things like gold or armor or weapons, which is the mechanism that gets people to talk to their friends about this game, which the closing government also wants. But thirdly, I think you have a larger incentive to bring friends over on our side of the house, because skill-based games are notably boring if there's no one to beat and no one to laugh at after you've beat them. So the reason why I started playing FIFA Mobile online, even though it's a horrible game, is because Oля told me there's this football mobile game and it's so fun. Let's play against each other. I was like, oh, cool. This could produce a lot of banter and memes, because when you play against each other, this creates jokes, it's fun, it's dynamic. So you want to bring friends over, because if you play alone, you don't know the people who you play with, it's incredibly boring. Fourthly, we can contact streamers on our side of the house to advertise the game. The reasons why stupid things like Raid Shadow Legends, which is literally the most basic turn-based shit ever, actually do get a following is because budding streamers like Doran's Movies and Willy actually support and advertise these things. However, they're only likely to advertise on our side of the house, because what streamers want on YouTube and Twitch is to have a consistent following. The following only exists insofar as it's dynamic. Therefore, streamers primarily want to opt into skill-based games because they get to show off their skills, show off their strategies, get people to want to copy them, get people to want to watch because people get invested in their results, similar to football fans watching football. So closing government is less likely to get that on their side of the house. But lastly, when they talk about the idea that hardcore gamers just spend in retail stores on headphones, that's why you want to partner with the local retail store. We're going to advertise headphones in our game in exchange for a cut of the revenue. Given this is a model motion, we get to model this in, but we also just think that a medium-sized company is going to be smart about this. What does this mean? First of all, that a lot of the harms of the government teams in terms of how many people we reach are relatively marginal. But secondly, not that all of this is a mechanism for the OO claim on why we actually get people to opt into esports and why we actually get popularity. So O cannot work without our case. Before moving on to the extension, just to deal with the idea of maintenance coming from closing government. First of all, I think that's uncomparative. I think people hate laggy servers on everything. Like if you play Among Us and it's laggy, you basically can't play the game. Or if it lags during Mario Kart, you just die, it probably pisses you off in any case. But secondly, I think it's just reverse engineer process that companies have already implemented before as to how to deal with these things, which reduces costs. But moving on to the extension why we get more revenue. Not on our side of the house, have a larger ability to create content which generates revenue over time. What does this mean? This means you can add rewards to the game that are paywalled, which means that you need to provide money to the company or to access them. Rewards such as getting a new weapon or armor or skin only make sense if they're not only a 3-second thrill, i.e. they only make sense if they create the feeling of, I cannot wait to try out my new AK-47 on the new map. I cannot wait to blast someone with my new fireball spell because I'm going to fucking crush them in the battlefield. The only way in this which exists is if you have a competitive game, because in a competitive game there is no end point, there's no beating the level. You can always move one step up the ladder. You can always win that one game against one competitor you've never won against, and so on and so forth. Which means that with every next reward, with every next patch, you create the everlasting and perpetual thrill of trying out the new reward, because the reward actually makes you better at the game. This is why half of Zagreb debating is currently spending money on Genshin waifus. This is why World of Warcraft players pay for things like paid boost to top level when they try out a new class, because they want to get competitive as soon as possible. Which is why we ensure a stream of revenue that is constant, and it's not just the initial cost of buying the video game, which is actually the mechanism for opening opposition's idea of people are going to buy DLCs. But secondly, I just think that most of government ventures the wrong characterization of the majority of people who play these games. Most people just like to log on and compete with their friends, just like log on to a multiplayer and laugh at crushing someone's ass. When I was a little kid, I didn't care about a lot of competition, but I liked playing co-op Warcraft 3 with my dad. It was fun to beat my dad, and he pretended he actually cared about it. A lot of people just log on to League and stuff like this after a long day, and some people are just semi-competitive. Like, they don't do this professionally. They still kind of care about leaderboards, still kind of want to go to the local tournament and grab the $30 prize and buy a couple of pints for friends in the bar and brag about how they won the local tournament. A lot of these people are not the people who are going to be scared of being quitters, are not the people who are going to be hugely stressed about losing at the game, and are not the hardcore gamers closing government talks about. There's a huge amount of individuals we can unlock on our side of the house. The problem of closing government, however, is they don't compare. Even in the best case for closing government, where all of the problems they talk about exist, they don't explain why they actually maintain a fan base on their side of the house and how they make the game diverse and interesting. We explain that, but we also explain there's a huge amount of player base you unlock past the characterization of opening government. Before I talk more about diversity within the game, I'm willing to give OG a chance to engage.
If it is true that you can buy a new fireball that is so powerful, why would people continue playing the game if they're financially locked out from being able to reach the highest levels?
Because they like competing with each other, and because insofar as they probably try the free-to-play version, this is something they get hooked on, but this is also something that happens after the initial subscription. So you're already a subscriber, which means you're already invested in the game, which means you're invested in the results, and therefore you want to pay. On diversity, we have a far larger ability to create diversity on our side of the house, because not on the government side, diversity is limited to the development team and their ideas, and probably the tropes they picked up from earlier games. So there's only so many random things that can happen, because there's only a limited amount of things programmed within the game, which means that after some time you've learned all the maps, you've learned all the knacks, you know when and where they happen, so it's no longer fucking random. On our side of the house, diversity is player generated, because every game is different, because players use different strategies, different combinations, different types of units and weapons, which means that every single match is different, which means that you create diversity. This is the incentive for people to keep on subscribing to the game. And I think the debating example is quite salient here, because we've seen most types of motions, but every debate is kind of different, because different combinations of teams and arguments. That's why Shaun is a good example from my side. He says, debating, but he still keeps debating. It's 3 a.m. where he still keeps debating. He's obviously interested in it because of the competitive thrill. But lastly, I think we just give more mechanisms for the esports thing. First of all, we mechanize why it's going to happen. But secondly, in terms of sources of revenue, it's not just people, being in sponsorship. It's people paying to enter tournaments. It's people following streamers wanting to try your game. It's other studios hiring you to be their developers. It's people wanting to buy your other games because they've seen your game being played in esports. Just a bunch more mechanisms. For all of these reasons, closing opposition wins the debate.
Thank you very much. And it's time for the live speeches, starting with kick off with Sher here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, hold on. Starting my POIs in the chat, but if I don't take one by 6 minutes, feel free to interrupt my speech and I will take it. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Who knew spending your nights playing games instead of matter loading would actually pay off in debating? I'm quite happy that we're clearly winning this debate already. First thing I want to bring out is the extension coming from Mikko, then take out the rest of the teams in the round. Mikko pointed out that it's extremely more expensive to run a skill-based game as opposed to a luck-based game. We gave you multiple reasons, one of them being that marketing becomes more expensive because all these things about hosting tournaments, hiring professional sports leagues, for example, or professional sports players, or doing things like paying streamers to teach tutorials because people need to learn different strategies in the games, all costs are upfront costs that are borne by the company who wants to market their particular corporation. The only response coming from Tin is to suggest, they can do it smartly and marketing can be done relatively cheaply. Hiring streamers might have been cheap at the start of the streaming industry, but now that the esports industry has relatively boomed, streamers are unlikely to be willing to get very cheap rates because they can potentially get from other corporations who are willing to pay higher rates. And therefore, it's exponentially more expensive now for us to be able to hire streamers and get the marketing necessary to convince pro or non-casual players to continue playing. But even if you believe that they can do marketing properly, Mikko gave you so many more reasons it's not responded to sufficiently. Firstly, the fact that servers are significantly more expensive. First of all, their counterexample to this is Among Us. Among Us is actually a skill-based game. There's barely any luck involved. But secondly, ping matters significantly more in Counter-Strike than Mario Kart. Even if it might frustrate some people, the marginal difference of being able to be shot in a split second is why ping is significantly more harmful under their side of the house. The fact that you have anti-hack clients, for example, or many people leave games because it's just too random already. There's too many auto-clickers. People can shoot through walls in multiple first-person shooters. And therefore, insofar as are able to monitor them, which requires either very advanced AI or a large team monitoring multiple rounds or accounting for reports, which are extremely expensive. You're not able to get that. Or things like meta testing or testing how to make the game significantly more fair, which means that any development of the game takes a significantly longer time for you to do so because you have to hire pro gamers to make sure the meta is significantly better in the round. But lastly, I want to note that a lot of these things are fixed costs. That is to say, getting a server, regardless of how many people you have, there are tiers of how much you can do for each server, and therefore you have to pay it a lot, even if you don't have a lot of revenue. Why is it important then that the closing government's extension on costs stands? Because I would suggest all the other teams in the round fixate on increasing revenue. Well, profit is obviously revenue minus cost, but I would suggest the cost part of the equation is significantly more important than increasing revenue. Here are a couple of reasons why. First, with respect to getting more profit, revenue has a lot more uncertain factors. Whether or not your marketing works, where a lot of people believe that marketing is relatively an art that you cannot always predict. How much market forces react, other people potentially competing with respect to your sales. Or thirdly, the fact that especially in the context of a very saturated market already and large competition, it is unlikely for you to be able to break in with a lot of revenue. But in comparison, these costs are relatively fixed because they're inherent to setting up a game that's decent and someone who actually wants to play. And therefore, there's a lot of variability with revenue. There's more certainty with cost. So reducing cost is a more important factor. Secondly, with respect to building the game, it is unclear that you actually have enough capital right now to be able to have enough investment to actually start up the game because the Infoslide says they're at early development stages. So it's either you have to get new investors to try to invest in your capital, or you might not even be able to afford the game in the first place since it's incredibly expensive, and therefore not be able to develop it when the costs pile up in the long run. But secondly, if it's dealing with investors are usually more loss averse. So even if the expected value is the same, a lot of psychologists have already shown that people are necessarily loss averse because they want to lose their money, and therefore it's a greater deterrent for investment. But secondly, if investors cannot meet the capitalization you need or the capital investment, they're unlikely to enter, and therefore reducing as much cost as possible is necessary to get as many potential investors to enter your state. Getting investment is more important than dealing with revenue, because for you to be able to get revenue in the first place, the game has to launch and become successful and actually operate. If not, you spent a lot of money developing the game, but not able to get any revenue, which is significantly worse than the potential of less revenue under our house. That's why that's the most important argument in today's debate, and we take it already. Before I move on, go ahead, Seal.
What is a medium-sized video game company? What are some examples?
Okay, so actually I want to bring it back now here, right? So the other assertion coming from Tin was that if you're a medium-sized corporation, you're likely to be able to compete because most corporations are actually medium-sized. First, I want to point out that intuitively, given that you have to choose between developing 1 or 2 games, then presumably it's already quite small to develop multiple different games. But here are the large corporations that are actually developing the games they suggest. Valve, for example, owns Dota and CSGO. Blizzard, for example, has all of Warcraft plus Hearthstone. Riot, for example, has Valorant and League of Legends. Notice, a lot of the large competition exists on both sides of the house, and therefore a medium-sized corporation is unlikely to become successful. But more importantly, these corporations I cited tend to have games that are skill-based. The largest corporations that exist for the gaming market are the skill-based games, and therefore you find significantly greater competition under their side of the house. The new extension we got coming from CO is that you're able to rework the games, and that's a good thing. This is a response to Mikko's analysis suggesting that reworking doesn't always pay off. Sometimes when you modify the game, people hate the game because it ruins the gameplay. A lot of people are against the different reworking of Civ 6, for example, because it changed how the gameplay was from Civ 5. But secondly, their examples don't make sense. Genshin is not a random game because you get random characters, or debating is probably far more luck-based when you're determining who judges you get and have to deal with things like racism. Thirdly, we would suggest that even if you get the benefit of reworking, that at best is a long-term benefit, which is to suggest it takes multiple years before you can relaunch your editions or relaunch lots of packs. Most games don't have that shelf life or don't have that turnover rate, and therefore it's unlikely for you to access the benefits on either side, even if you're marginally more likely to have reworking under their side of the house. Then I want to deal with opening opposition's retention. Because even if you believe that if you're invested in the game, you're more likely to play it later on, we gave you 2 lines of response. One, your ability to gain retention is nuanced to a small company or medium company rather, which we suggest that you need an initial large market size already, because if not, you're sorting a lot of people in the same pool who are not skill differentiated with one another, and therefore they're likely to be third. But secondly, that retention or that desire goes to individual players, other secondary markets like mice. And if you're a medium-sized company, it's unlikely you sell all these accessory parts also, because that requires even more capital, and therefore it's unlikely to go to the corporation. So even if you have retention, that's less important. But lastly, on accessibility, I agree opening government asserts that most people don't like being competitive. We beat opening opposition government in that regard because we explained to you why the groups that are most important with revenue, children who typically spend the most amount of money in entertainment because they don't have other things to spend on, or a growing population of women who are more likely to be flamed in skill-based games, are the clear mechanisms to explain why we get more accountability on our side. But even if you get that opening government, we explained to you that cost is the most important metric in today's debate, and that's why you have to clearly take it over everyone else. I just want to say, PogChan.
Thank you very much to the government whip and to sum up the debate as a whole, up whip.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Even if the association with Cyberpunk 2077 wasn't enough, I think all the problems that Tin identifies are exactly why we'd much rather have Doxbot 420 writ large. Here's the misconception that GovBench fails to identify. It is one, that nowhere in GovBench you actually get a characterization of why once people start to play, they actually remain hooked on it. Because the consequence of the vast majority of luck-based games like Among Us, which literally is not ranked, unlike League of Legends or World of Warcraft or anything else like that, like Among Us, like Fall Guys, is people play very quickly for like 4 months, but the second you introduce money into the equation, when the second you had Flappy Bird charged 99 cents on the App Store, that is exactly when everyone deleted it off their phone and the stuff just went bam. Even if closing government can prove that they have less costs starting up, they never once proved to you that they successfully increased revenue writ large. That is the problem with GovBench writ large. That is the problem and why we win the debate. One, I want to talk about closing government. Closing government says you have to spend on lots of stuff like streamers and servers. The first thing I want to say here is I just do not think they understand what a medium-sized game company is. Yes, it is true. We are not producing 2 games. The reason for that is not because we literally don't have the capacity to produce 2 games. I'm sure a medium-sized company could produce 2 shitty games every season if it wanted to, but rather that we want to make one game really, really well. There are tons of examples of video game companies that are not particularly large, like Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment, that aside from Fortnite, just produces a bunch of Lego Star Wars games, which are also great, but not part of this motion. But like their biggest game is Fortnite. It costs them relatively little to make because they're a medium-sized video game company. Sega is a medium-sized video game company. All these game companies are ones that have experience in the first place. Here's the stuff that Tin pointed out that I think beats their case. It is not true that medium-sized game companies have like never run gaming servers before. It is not true that they don't have anti-cheat software in their other games. So I think the problem from closing government needed to be that maybe it is true that if you're a small game developer and this is literally your first game, maybe it is true that you do not have any of that software writ large. One, I would like to point out that the best anti-cheating software is not AI for detecting it. It's literally just telling your reporter or telling your players to like report cheating. Like the way League of Legends tracks cheaters is quite literally you like report at the end of the game whether or not you thought they were cheaters in the first place. I'm sure they have more sophisticated AI software and other things, but it literally doesn't matter because there are still easy basic ways to make sure that people aren't smurfing, that people aren't hacking, all of which we still get access to. But I think this just had a misconception that you literally had quite no resources on the other side, which I think is ludicrous. I also think there's tons of open source anti-cheat software out there because there are relatively invested computer programmers who really like playing games and maybe really don't like being hacked against. So they want and have an incentive to make things like open source software. The next thing to say was just, the streamers like aren't cheap. I don't think that's true. Like maybe it's really expensive to hire like random Minecraft streamers like Dream, but I think like there are lots and lots of Twitch streamers, and the fact that there are so many of them means it's relatively easy to say, hey, I'll give you lots of money if you do this one particular thing, or I'll give you a moderate amount size of money if you do this one particular thing. Their argument is like, no, streamers are now more expensive, but this makes no sense because there are literally so many of them, they can't afford to be charging high rates for seeing these things. Here is why this is important, because the problem with closing government is that even if they identify all these reasons why there are costly things, remember, things are still costly on their side of the house. People just don't like League and other games. I have friends that play Mario Kart or play Among Us, which is a luck-based game. And when there's lag, they just like stop playing it writ large. And so there's literally no way for closing government to actually access all the cost stuff because there are still probably comparatively similar costs on their side, even if not as high. We're totally fine to accept that. The point is a mid-sized company is likely to suffer these regardless. The benefits that we get are massive. What did Tin say that I think won this round in and of itself? Tin told you that the consequence was that you are likely to get people more hooked on our side. And I think this went far beyond whatever opening opposition told you. Because what Tin told you is that the progression that you had in these games was likely to incentivize people to stay a part of it. That is to say, when you got rewards in things like Call of Duty, you could, when you did better, you could purchase things like kill streaks with like your in-game points, or the fact that when you like did better, you unlocked certain things like kill streaks in Call of Duty. And all these rewards made you better and more invested in the game, so you were likely to stick with it longer. The second thing that Tin told you is that you had more diversity because every single match was different. How does this contrast with what government bench as a whole tells you? The misconception of government bench is simple. They argue that the only people that are interested in things like League of Legends or PUBG are hardcore gamers. I want to posit to you that this is not true. I played 2 games of League of Legends this morning. Like I'm not a pro gamer by any means, unlike Mikko, but I think I still like the casual sense of competitiveness, and I'm still willing to engage in that. Tin points out that the entire premise of opening government as to why people are so competitive in life and still choose to be competitive when they play games or do debate is exactly why people are likely to want to do this, even if they aren't pro gamers. I want to characterize this for you. 1 billion people play PUBG. Not all of those people are hardcore gamers. Many of them are casual gamers. 1 billion people play Fortnite. 500 million people play like Candy Crush. On our side of the house, I actually think you get consistent user bases because people are incentivized and want to stick with these things in the long run for all the reasons Tin gives you. Opening opposition. Opening opposition talks a lot about a few things. They talk about dopamine kicks, monetization, and ceiling of skill / progression. I want to talk about monetization. The way you have monetization is you build a consistent player base. On both sides, it is very hard to monetize immediately after the launch. That is to say, casuals aren't going to switch from Candy Crush over to Dox something 2077 because they're not going to want to if they know they have to watch ads for it. And this is dangerous because the problem with luck-based games is they're so much less likely to stick. Before I explain why, I'll take opening off or opening depth. Closing.
So the cost is multiple, but beyond that, you're competing against the largest companies in the gaming market if you do a skill-based game versus under our side of the house where you don't. But if you have high retention, then presumably it's also hard to compete with the new market and try to persuade people to shift to your game.
one, I'm pretty sure Candy Crush is also owned by similarly large video game companies. Two, I actually think it's so much harder because the mechs from open and government turn against them. The fact that the vast majority of people that play these luck-based games are literally just chasing the dopamine kick and don't care about any features of the game mean that it's impossible for you to differentiate your game from anyone else. Here's the only mechanism, literally the only mechanism about how the game spread that closing government gave. You talk about it at parties. Like, guys, that's not an actual mechanism. It's not how it actually happens. And if anything, it makes it much worse because CG's mechanism of parties is why these games have very large fads but quickly fall out of popularity because casual players don't have real stakes in the game. And when your friend from a party stops playing the game, you do too. This is exactly why when Flappy Bird charged 99 cents, it got pulled off the App Store. There are multiple reasons why we are more sticky. That is to say, because you build rewards. So when you win, you earn rewards. It makes you better at the game and you're more incentivized to play it. The fact that you have to play the game with friends and you build up communities around this, like when I play League with my friends from home, all of those reasons that Tim gave that weren't engaged with. The last thing that open and government tells you is plausibly about something like dopamine kicks, which I think Ton talks to you about. One, about why this is bad for game retention writ large, because you cannot differentiate between this and any other game. And two, because people really just do like competition and are willing to do this. I think that's fine in and of itself. I also think it puts us over our opening. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to Upwit and to all debaters for this final. Can we ask or come to open the breakout room for judges or to move us?